Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Tony Mannion and I'm Sales Development Manager at SolutionsPT. And I'd like to welcome you to what I think is a really exciting webinar. So Artificial Intelligence, Real Protection for OT. And to help me on the webinar today, in fairness to do most of the heavy lifting, I'm joined by Lee Carter, who's Cybersecurity Product Manager here at SolutionsPT, and also Elliot Gidley, who's a Senior Sales Executive with BlackBerry Cylance. So welcome, guys.
Welcome, everyone.
Hi, guys.
Okay, so Lee, I said I was excited about this, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later on. But just to put it into context, a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is antivirus. From a market perspective, is that still a big topic with our customers? And what sort of other topics are you speaking to people about at the moment? What's hot in the market?
We are seeing a lot of interest, Tony, and some really good uptake with Cylance Protect. And this is on partially connected networks and also some deployments where we've got devices that are just pretty much always offline. I'm also pleased to see that optics is being considered to provide EDR as well. But generally, we see that more with some of the more mature customers that we have that they've already got like network monitoring, which is in place, and they're looking to get some kind of similar visibility on their endpoints. The deployments and POCs that we've done, they've all been very successful. And I think a lot of that is due to the testing that our team's done beforehand with solutions from Wonderware and Cytec to make sure that there's no incompatibilities anywhere. Interestingly, we often see peaked interest from customers after a compelling reason, but equally we've got many customers who are just realizing they want something a little bit better, and they just want to reduce their overall cost of ownership. One customer said to me once, he said that Cylance is like AV with teeth, and that's always resonated with me. In other areas, we're seeing increased demand for monitoring in general, so products like Clarity. We're seeing people that are potentially turning away from IT-OT hybrids for more dedicated OT monitoring solutions. As a security professional, my mind does actually boggle a little bit because you have these complex SCADA systems that they visualize, they record critical values, but then people go ahead and just overlook the monitoring of the same systems that are actually providing that service. We've also had some recent interaction from our 62443 certified security architects on secure by design solutions. Personally, I'm seeing a bit of a slowdown in site consulting and networking because of the pandemic, but equally we're seeing a rise in secure remote access. And I think probably the last big area I'm seeing is just an increased interest in thin client technology, people looking to reduce down the management of the attack surface, as well as some customers looking at things like hardened builds down to CIS standards.
Okay, so still a wide breadth of solutions that people are looking at, possibly depending on where they are in their journey. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've got roughly half an hour for the webinar because we know after that you'll start getting tired, and your time is very valuable. So as we go through, if you do have any questions and answers, please use the question and answer box and we will try to get to them. Any that we don't get through during the webinar, we'll hopefully respond to personally afterwards. So I mentioned I was excited, Lee, and one of the reasons being I've spent probably quite a bit of time over the last 18 months, 2 years, looking at standards documents, regulatory requirements for a lot of our customers, depending on their industries. And pretty much everyone high up on the list talks about endpoint protection in the OT environment.
Yeah.
So am I reading that right in thinking that antivirus is possibly a sort of cornerstone for any cybersecurity strategy?
I think actually the strategy is much bigger than a single point solution. I'd always advocate that people operate within a defined framework. 6443 is ideal for OT, but then there's elements it doesn't cover, such as governance. The NCSE's CAF's very, very good, and I think if you blend it together, OG86 from the HSE directive, that that's very good because it blends both together. We also see a lot of customers who are looking for NIST 800X. That's very, very popular. But with any framework, the key thing is to actually plan ahead, to be able to check your progress, and really there should be some level of independence in there. Someone who's abstracted away from internal conflicts. Regarding cybersecurity and AV, it is the foundation of detect and protect in the cybersecurity framework, and it helps address endpoints where most breaches happen. If you then bolster EDR on top of that, so you get visibility, that really helps our customers in the regulated verticals under NIST, and especially with principles C1 and C2, which can often be quite challenging to address. Endpoint protection as well, it is the lowest cost solution, and it does probably provide the greatest return on investment. But I'd say that after a business continuity and disaster recovery, because if you can't recover your function, you're quickly going to be out of business. Recovery is the last phase of the framework. It's often overlooked, and really I think it should be after identifying them, in my honest opinion.
Some really good points there, Lee. Thank you. So, yeah, you're right. It needs to be part of an overall strategy, and it needs to be at the right time for each individual customer based on their priorities and circumstances. So we've been talking about AV. The topic of the webinar is about total protection for OT environments. So I guess this would be a good point for you to perhaps tell us a little bit about what BlackBerry Cylance actually is. And we all have a version of what AV is in our heads. Perhaps you can just expand and tell us exactly what benefits BlackBerry Cylance delivers to the customers.
Thanks, Tony. Let me just share my screen so I can give you a couple of visual aids while we're talking through. So traditional based AV is pretty much everything on the right hand side of your screen under the red box. It's a reactive based solution. So things like signatures, heuristics, behavioral analysis, cloud lookup, sandboxing, all of these potentially introduce risk and can allow something called a patient zero, which means someone gets infected while other solutions are doing analysis, determine something's good or bad, and then potentially block it for all other users. That's fine, but if you have something like ransomware in an OT environment and it takes down one of your critical servers, this is a problem. Now, Cylance is different. Cylance uses a predictive nature using AI, as you mentioned, Tony. So we don't need to have seen that threat specifically before. We don't do signatures, we don't do hash lookups. We use a predictive capability to be able to determine if a known, but crucially an unknown file is malicious or not. And this works perfectly in an OT environment. Because we don't have to manage that signature database, you don't have to do signature updates on an hourly, daily basis like you currently do. With Cylance, we typically update the maths model every 9 months or so. So you can have devices completely standalone, locked down, no USB keys wandering in once a week to do signature updates, which is always going to have you behind the curve. So the way that we built the Cylance maths model in the first place back in 2012 is we collected roughly 500 million files. They were 250 million genuine and 250 million malicious. We then extracted all of the features, all of the things that those files could do. And we came out with 1.6 million unique features of files. So what that means, guys, is any file on your machine can do one or many of 1.6 million different things. We then categorize them as either a good or a potentially suspicious or malicious feature. And there's a scoring system that then tallies up a number of suspicious or malicious features to then determine that file is bad. What that allows us to do is identify never been seen before threats. Now, I'm just going to quickly whiz through this build here. Probably some of those names on there you'll recognize. They are ransomware threats from 2017. I'm sure everyone is fully aware of the sort of middle far right WannaCry threat. Everyone has heard of it. And I'm going to focus on that simply because everyone has heard of it and may have been impacted by it. You can see below each threat, you have a minus in months. So in the case of WannaCry, it's minus 19 months. And this is because we identified WannaCry 19 months before it was ever released, before it was ever in the public. And how is that possible? How can you identify something before it was ever even created or maybe even dreamt of by the guys that were behind WannaCry? And the reason why is on that unfortunate, unfaithful day in May, Friday in May 2017, when WannaCry came out, I managed to get hold of some samples and I dropped it on the latest version of Cylance. And it was connected to the internet and it was up to date, and we determined that it was malicious and stopped it real time within 100 milliseconds. And that's key with ransomware, because ransomware will start to encrypt anywhere between 5 to 15 seconds. So if you're waiting for sandbox analysis, that could take 3 or 4 minutes. By the time it comes back and says, yes, it's bad, you've already lost a lot of your data. Now, we identified that, but I thought, hang about, what if I drop this on our first publicly available version of the mass model from 2015? No internet connection, no updates. Drop WannaCry on there and it identified it. It was released 19 months before WannaCry was, but it identified it not because it was matching a signature, not because it had seen it before, but because of the features. What that WannaCry file was trying to do was malicious. And that is the predictive capability of AI. And all of the other threats you can see on the screen, again, you can see how we predicted and picked them up before they were ever created. And one sort of anecdotal caveat, I guess, to this is on the day of WannaCry, within the first hour or two of release, pretty much every signature-based AV solution missed WannaCry. That's why it was such a big deal. 2 to 4 hours later, they'd written a signature, they'd identified it, you were protected. But what if you were one of those first businesses that got hit with it? You would have been in trouble. If you had Cylance, you wouldn't have been. So beyond just file-based analysis, we can do a number of other things. So we can look at memory resident threats. So we can look at things like privilege escalation, process injection, memory scraping, stack pivots, etc. We can also identify malicious scripts. So a lot of, I think, depending where you read, something like 70% of initial infections come through some sort of spear phishing email, which either has a URL link or has a Word document, a PDF with a malicious script in it. Now that could be a PowerShell, a VB, a macro, C script, J script, W script, etc. We will identify these and we will be able to terminate that script before it ever pulls down the malicious payload. We can also control device access. So USB keys, we can control based on manufacturer, we can control it based on model or serial number. And ultimately what you can say is block all USB sticks except these, or allow all USB sticks except these. So you have a way of controlling device access. One other thing that we do that is actually really ideal for the OT estate is application control. So what application control is, it's almost like, if you can imagine traditional whitelisting, but in the reverse. So instead of having to, every time a new application comes out, approve it, allow it, then stop the previous application from being allowed to run, it's an ongoing maintenance headache. With application control from BlackBerry Cylance, what we do is we say the current running state of that machine is safe after a full scan. And then if you wanted to introduce any new applications, you list a change window, allow the application to run, lock it down again. But no other applications can run. If they're not already loaded into memory, they are not allowed to load into memory. So an example is you have a manufacturing plant, you have one application on there, controls a robotic arm, someone then logs on and wants to get their email. Someone wants to open up a browser, someone wants to open Word or Excel. This is not going to be possible. If those processes aren't already running, they will not be allowed to run. So it goes beyond just malware visibility and control, and actually control of your OT estate, meaning you don't have accidental damage to your environment or insider attacks. And there's a number of different deployment options that we have with Cylance. We cover lots of different operating systems, which I'll cover in a minute, but from a deployment point of view, we can do purely cloud for your IT kind of environment. We can do purely on-prem for your OT, and we have something called hybrid, which is basically a way of controlling the communication out. So rather than exposing your servers directly to the internet, what we can do is have a controlled proxy that runs a very hardened version of CentOS, and it controls the communication from agent to management console. So you still have global visibility. Anywhere in the world, you can see your OT estate, but you're not exposing your OT estate directly to the internet. Over to you, Tony.
Well, that explains the AV with teeth comment, because there's a lot of stuff in there that perhaps goes above and beyond what my original thinking was. And I've got files on this computer that I can't get to do one function, never mind 1.6 million. So I can really see, Elliot, where we can start to add some huge benefit to our OT customers. But they do have some hurdles, and whenever I talk to customers about antivirus, I tend to come across two main groups. We've got customers who haven't got it, or maybe customers who've got antivirus. You mentioned before about having a signature released in 4 hours. Some of these haven't updated their signatures in 4 years because the systems are isolated, because it's a manual process that they have their day jobs to do. We also have a number of customers who are a little bit frightened based on the fact that their equipment's not perhaps the usual IT-based equipment, in as much as it's older, it might be running older operating systems, and also it mightn't have been developed or designed to run multiple applications. So it might be short on resources, and therefore they don't want to add an additional application because they don't want to risk overrun on those resources that they've got. So talking to those sorts of points, how would Cylance be able to help those customers to deploy this level of protection?
Yeah, absolutely. And I share your experience with the OT estate. We have a number of energy and manufacturing, government-based organizations that have very controlled networks, sometimes completely air-gapped, isolated, sometimes partial connectivity. They do have XP still, they do have 2003 still. These devices, but just by the nature of the operating system, are old, which means they have limited physical resources, CPU, memory, bandwidth, disk space, etc. And they really see endpoint security as an inhibitor to their business, to the core function of the business, because it drains resources, it needs constant management. And that's where BlackBerry Cylance can alleviate all of those kind of pain points for your typical OT estate. First of all, we cover those legacy operating systems, XP, 2003 server, all the way up to Windows 10 and 2019. We cover Mac, which maybe is not so relevant in OT, but we do cover Linux as well, which is going to be very relevant in OT. Things like CentOS, Red Hat, Ubuntu, SUSE, Amazon Linux, for example. So we can cover a full plethora of operating systems, both new and old. As I mentioned, we're very low in resources. We don't use signatures, and we don't manage a signature database. And because of that, we typically use 60 meg of memory at idle. Most traditional AV uses between 200 to 400 meg of memory at idle without doing anything, without any analysis. CPU usage is far less, disk IO is far less, and because we're not doing that hourly signature updates, if there is any connectivity, we're not saturating the bandwidth either. So from a resource point of view, we can actually give resources back to your OT estate. Anecdotally, I have a customer that was running traditional AV in a virtualized environment. They had 35 virtual desktops per physical server. And when they moved to BlackBerry Cylance, they then could increase that to 42 virtual desktops per physical server. And what that meant is when they came to do the hardware refresh, they could buy less tin, ultimately saving them money. So there is a genuine return on investment in as well as reducing risk, because you don't have that gap for doing updates, for example. You know, the typical way of updating with traditional AV is wandering around with a USB in an isolated environment. You're always behind the curve. Even if that latest signature identifies the latest threats, you quite often can be days or even weeks behind the curve. With Cylance, you don't have that that limitation, because we're not looking to match against a hash. We are looking at the actual file itself and what it's trying to do. So some of the other things as well that we can, that are ideal for the OT estate is, as I say, that air-gapped, partially connected or fully connected environment. Now, different customers' OT is different. Some is managed by IT and global. Some is completely isolated and managed by themselves. And we give you that capability. So if you want that global visibility, you can have that. If you want dedicated, isolated management, we can offer that as well. So we can cover the OT estate in its entirety.
Thanks, Elliot. That's really good. And I can certainly see how that would change the way some people are able to protect their systems. So that was really useful. Thank you.
No problem.
It was interesting, Elliot, you mentioned IT there. And I guess cybersecurity is probably one of the main areas at the moment that's bringing IT and OT together. Well, certainly what I'm finding. And very often IT are involved. Sometimes they're in charge of specifying what protection we can put in place, even in an OT level. And all the things you talked about at the moment, I can certainly see adding huge benefit to OT. So I kind of wonder there, you know, how come you're so big with IT? Because you've got a massive installations around the world. What do IT see from this sort of a solution that would help our customers to get buy-in?
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of the same problems you experience in OT, you can experience in IT as well. So, for example, we've got a global manufacturer that has offices in like 124 different countries. Now, imagine some of these are parts of the world that don't have the most reliable connections, the fastest links. Sometimes they're even going across satellite connections, which is obviously very expensive from a bandwidth point of view. So the fact that Cylance can run isolated, the fact that it can run with minimal bandwidth, minimal updates, it massively increases the efficiency of those parts of the world. But on top of that, you have that global visibility. So if you've got a global manufacturer who's all over the world, you can have a single point of access to look at both IT and OT, if you allow it. If you want to totally separate OT, you can as well, and still manage that locally. So there's some real benefits there, but really it's risk reduction. The whole idea, I mean, these are sort of nice to have benefits that we talked about from Cylance or BlackBerry Cylance around the OT space, but really the core function is risk reduction. It's about protecting you against the unknown. Most traditional solutions are going to identify the known, but may struggle with the unknown. But the way that BlackBerry Cylance works and its predictive capability means we can identify, as I gave that example earlier of WannaCry and many others, we can identify risks and threats before they ever really become public.
Excellent. Thank you, Elliot. Just before I move on, we've got a question that's come through. So we've been asked, how does BlackBerry Cylance handle file extensions in our OT world for programming packages that sometimes confuse antivirus, the Rockwell, Siemens, IFM, etc.?
Yeah.
Is that an answer we can give?
Yeah, so we have certain versions. The way that certifications work with people like Siemens and Rockwell is you have to have a certain version of your application which is then certified to run on that particular solution. So we have some certified versions of the Cylance Protect agent to run in Rockwell, Siemens, etc. So we work in those environments and we work with those manufacturers or solution providers to offer that. Now, we can identify threats. They're not just necessarily executables or not just .exes or .dlls, binary files. We can identify, sys files and a plethora of others. There are potentially some file extensions in some weird and strange operating system that we may not be able to identify. But for the vast majority of our customers, and we have a real mix of, when it comes to OT, government, healthcare, manufacturing, energy, shipping, all sorts of different types of people, users of OT, and we can cover 99% of their operating systems and applications.
Okay, that's great. Hopefully that answers the question. If not, please do feel free to get in touch directly with myself or with your local Solutions PT area manager, and we'd be happy to come back on any other questions that you may have. So I guess I said I was excited about the webinar, and actually it's lived up to expectations, because I think there's been a lot that I've learned as we've gone through. Some of the major things, I think it's fair to say, we may not have said it explicitly enough, but actually if you've got antivirus that's protecting your assets and it's not kept up to date, then really you're not protecting your assets. And even more so, when new threats come out, you're still vulnerable. So it is a situation that can make people uncomfortable. What we've seen today, that actually AI has that ability to give us an advantage that we certainly wouldn't have otherwise. And I think when you look at the innovation from some of the cybercrime that's happening at the moment, any advantage you could take is huge. I think there are discussions that have to be had within the business, because it should be part of an overall strategy. And we certainly work with a lot of customers where perhaps we almost try to take them back to the beginning sometimes, to make sure that whatever they spend in cyber protection is going to give them the return on investment that they were expecting. So what you don't want to do is run before you can walk. And sometimes it's very, very tempting to be able to look at a product and just see that product on its own and look at it in its own bubble. So hopefully people who've attended today have found this to be useful, certainly as useful as I have. What's the next steps? Well, realistically, one of the funny things that we went through at the beginning of putting this webinar together was, unfortunately, having Elliot take so much content out of what he was going to show, because we've only got 30 minutes. And we could quite literally do, you know, a good few hours just talking about Cylance Protect on its own and the features and benefits that could give. So we appreciate this is only a taster. What we'd like to do is, if you think this is something that will add benefit to your business, or if you want to see what other people are doing in the cyber world, in their OT environment, how other people are protecting, then please do contact us. We can certainly arrange deep dives so that you can have a look more into the product. You can decide if this product's going to be something that you want to look at further. We can talk to you about your strategy, where it might fit, if there are any other priorities that you might see along the way. And we can also help you to evaluate, because at the end of the day, no matter what we say, it's how this performs for your business that's going to be the important thing. And so if we can help you to see that, if we can help you to evaluate that, then there are various ways that we will do that, and hopefully it will help you to make the right decision. So I'd like to thank you for coming along today. I'd like to thank Lee and Elliot for really giving some fantastic content and some fantastic discussion about certainly one of the ways that I think is going to be important going forward for all of our customers to protect their environments. So thanks very much indeed, and I'll hopefully speak to more of you as we go forward. And as I say, please do get in touch. We'd love to explore this further with you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks very much.